3.
Order, and welcome to the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee. And today it's our first session in the inquiry, Unlocking Community Energy at Scale. We'll be considering topics including the government's local power plan to be delivered by Great British Energy, shared ownership of local energy projects, and ways to attract more private investment into the community energy sector. And we have our first panel here already, and I will ask you to introduce yourselves. So if we can start on this side and work our way along, please.
My name is Marna, McMillin, and I am the CEO of Energy for All and have been since 2006.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Louise Marix, Strategic Director for Net Zero Terrace Street for Rossendale Valley Energy, which is in Lancashire.
Thank you.
My name is Holliday. I'm the CEO for Community Energy Scotland. We are the membership organisation working with and on behalf of more than 400 community energy groups in Scotland.
Good afternoon, Jake Burnyeat from Communities for Renewables, or CFR. We're a not-for-profit company that helps communities generate their own energy, and we look after 50 megawatts of community-owned solar across 7 different local energy enterprises.
Thank you all very much. And with a panel of 4 people, there is the potential for this for us to have quite a lot of comment. So I'll encourage you where you can to keep your contribution short. But equally, if somebody's already said something, don't feel obliged to comment and answer each question. I will start with this question though. In no more than a few sentences, can you tell us what is community energy? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to offer that one.
Thank you.
So, principle rather than legal definition, but community energy it's about not-for-profit enterprises that are locally owned, locally governed, and are set up to serve their local communities by generating energy from locally owned renewables, ideally supplying that energy at a low and stable cost to local consumers, and reinvesting the surplus profits into supporting the hard-to-do stuff, which requires local knowledge and trusted local capacity, tackling fuel poverty, retrofitting our housing stock, and positively engaging people in the low-carbon transition.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have a variation on that definition?
Just very slightly, I suppose, from the Community Energy Scotland perspective, it would be wider than just generation. But again, the same focus on people coming together to create locally controlled, decentralised solutions that meet local needs. But those might cut across heat, transport, etc. as well, though I recognise today we may focus more on generation. And that it's important that those organisations are prioritising the wider good of the communities and preventing disproportionate personal gain.
And Louise Marix.
Yeah, I can add on top of it, I suppose, in that very much here to stay within a community, but also adding into how does it contribute to the future energy system in terms of flexibility, storage, and how we can roll in tackling our building stock into this as well, so that we're bringing everyone, particularly people who are left out of the energy transition, in with us, which is what we're trying to do in our Net Zero Terrace Street project.
And Marna, McMillin.
I would suggest, as well as the community of place, there's also a community of interest. And if you need to raise finance to do projects in deprived areas, you may need to look outside of that locality in order to find the money.
Thanks very much. Louise Marix, you used this term left out of the energy transition. I'll ask you all this question, but how can developing community energy help to build support for the energy transition?
I think it's really important, isn't it? Because we've got hostility to this sort of sense sometimes that what is it's going to cost us a lot of money to get to net zero. What's it doing for me, apart from pushing my bills up, is a sort of narrative that we hear. And in the communities that we are serving in Rossendale, where 40% of the houses are terraces, where you're not going to get an air source heat pump in, you're probably not going to afford to put solar on or insulate your home necessarily because of the deprived nature of it and the high number of private rental as well. So we're mixed tenure. You've got people there who can't afford to join in, say, having PV, a battery and an electric vehicle, who are then charging things for 12p a unit. So they are left out. They're also potentially at risk of being put onto an electric boiler, which will cheap for a landlord to install, it's already happening, but very expensive for them to run in a leaky cold house. So those people who could be brought in across an area, who can work together and then form more of an energy club and be looked after by that community or served by that community energy organisation, raising finance in the way perhaps my colleagues here raise finance, perhaps through bigger investors or with patient capital. And then those customers can pay back through a service charge that's kept to a low price over time, and their flexibility can be brought together, and then they can get that money back to keep their charges low. So that's the kind of model that we're trying to develop, which is much more than generation, and it sits at that grid edge. It is a difficult innovation project we're working on, funded by Innovate UK, luckily. They can join in that and see those benefits and be part of a future energy system. So it's doing the harder stuff, but they would also be supported by the larger scale generation. So we're putting in nearly 500 kilowatts on a factory roof, for example, in the same area we're working in.
And how would the rest of you see the role that community energy has in supporting or in building support for the energy transition? And perhaps when you're answering, if you could say something about how encouraged you are by the government's plans for Great British Energy and the role that community energy plays within them.
So I think, in short, the answer is about ownership. I think that when communities stop being seen as passive recipients of a system and start being seen as having an active role and a significant stake in the future of our energy generation, storage and supply, in addressing environmental concerns, sharing the benefits across their communities and engaging local people, that has an increase in the engagement they have with the projects and in turn in the local resilience. Recent polling by Commonwealth showed that there was a significantly higher percentage of people would support community energy projects, 62% of people compared to 40% if it was a private development, and that is even more stark where it's almost double in the devolved nations in Wales and Scotland. In brief, in terms of my response to Great British Energy and the local power plan is that I would like to see a lot more detail. I think it's quite hard to comment because there's still not a huge amount of detail released. But I think that what has been encouraging from our perspective is seeing how often communities are mentioned within the documents. We've become very accustomed to opening policy and legislative documents that don't have a mention of communities or, again, only mention them as passive recipients. So I hope that, the role that they are given and the priority will feed through into action.
Thank you. Yes, Marna McMillin, yes, please.
We are in the business of offering the general public, the man on the bus, the woman in the supermarket, something tangible they can do about climate change. They can come together and invest in a project, make that project happen, and work with others to get that word out, to pass that word out to other people in their locality, and then do other projects, move on from the first project, start doing other projects. So it's that engagement, it's as Zoe said, it's the ownership, it's the engagement, it's the feeling that you are doing something about climate change.
And in written evidence, we've been told there needs to be a clearer definition of community energy. I mean, actually, we had a very precise definition in many ways from you, Jake Burnyeat, at the start. But I wonder, how should the government find a precise definition that reflects the full range of projects in the sector, which goes from hyper-local to large scale? And perhaps, Marna McMillin, you can go first, and then I'll come back to Jake Burnyeat.
I think it is quite difficult. I think the most important thing about community energy is that it is not set up to enrich a small group of people, but that the benefits are spread widely across the whole of society. And I think that is the fundamental point about community energy.
Okay. And Jake Burnyeat.
I think you need a combination of broad objectives, what is community energy trying to achieve, and then some technical definitions that tie things down when it comes to preferential policies. So we've discussed the broad objectives, and when it comes to tying the legal definition down so that preferential policies achieve what they're intended to do and aren't games, we can put forward some suggestions on tighter legal definitions than have been used in the past, but it will be a set of legal entities that are eligible, but more than that. Okay.
I'll move on to the local power plan and its funding for community energy. We've heard from written evidence that the maximum grants available under current funding schemes may not be large enough for large-scale projects, and that the scope of the funding should be widened. Perhaps you can give us a sense of how many projects are held back by this problem. And if I start with Zoe Holliday, please.
I can provide actual kind of numbers following this. I couldn't give you numbers offhand, but I think in terms of projects, it's very difficult right now to build a business case for community energy because of the lack of long-term support for community energy. What we saw a massive uptake in the time of the feed-in tariff, and then it kind of dropped off after that. Right there now, there is kind of no specific mechanism that gives a long-term security of income for projects, and that makes it quite hard to build the project, which then means that there's even more reliance on the kind of initial funding. In Scotland, we obviously have a slightly different context because we have the CARES programme rather than the KEF. The CARES does have slightly higher amounts have been available, and there's a lot of learning that can be brought from CARES. One of the greatest positives is that it has been running since 2010, and there is a kind of general commitment from the Scottish Government towards community energy. However, the actual individual strands of funding are still within each year, and that can make it quite difficult for communities who want to plan for projects which obviously take a number of years to develop. So, you know, there is still kind of some gaps in that support, but certainly a lot of positives like the kind of pre-development stage funding for feasibility and those sort of phases where it's quite difficult to get funding. And then, kind of recently, in the most recent generation funding, there was funding up to 250k for generation projects, which I believe is higher. I think it's about 150k was available in the community energy fund. So, definitely the need for that. But alongside that, a real need for capacity building. I know we'll probably come to that later, but just to really emphasise that kind of without that capacity building element, the funding.
Sure. And Jake Burnyeat.
The question was specifically about the amount of feasibility funding required, but I would definitely endorse what Zoe said, that there's no point putting more and more feasibility money into a sector where we're struggling to make the business model work. So we have to fix the business model. Coming back to that question, the Community Energy Fund and CARES equivalent, I think, are well structured for the initial work. The 40k feasibility grant is a good amount. The 100k, if well used, gets you a good way through the development process. But for a medium to large scale community energy project, for example, a 15 megawatt solar farm, the actual risk investment through to financial close of the construction finance is probably £400,000. But the follow-on investment, once the project has largely been de-risked at the earlier stage, it needn't be a grant, it could be a contingent loan. Yeah. So the successful projects could pay back that money. Thank you.
Now, Zoe Holliday and Louise Marix Evans, you've both suggested that to avoid a stop-start funding cycle, the local power plan should dovetail with existing schemes. Can you tell us how this might be achieved in terms of sequencing? And perhaps Louise Marix Evans, you go first.
I think there's something there about we can have stop-start schemes in retrofit and grants. So we've got the Warm Homes grant just announced today. So that's doing houses with a grant that just goes out the door and does a number of houses, which I fully support. It's really important. But And then on the other hand, we're doing stuff around the energy system, which the houses are connected to. So could we dovetail that? So could there be a proportion of the Warm Homes grant that has to be used linking into the energy system, for example, with our project? And also, could there be some form of continuity brought through as well? So we're always being asked to innovate, that we should draw in funding, and that we should push the envelope a bit further. So we can put in generation, but how does it link to the grid, and how does it do more? I think we can work it much harder. So ideally, we would like to see a proportion of that money for Lancashire or Greater Manchester put into that innovation space, use that funding, and then really pull in that private investment money to do the harder to do bits, but wrap it in perhaps one investment wrapper. And then do something over the long term, rather than fit and forget and then go away. Just make it go much further, and that's what we're trying to do. And to that, I'd also add, even just access to bridge funding, small groups that are paid in arrears. You find people, I mean, in the past, I've not for Rossendale Valley Energy, but put money on my own credit card only to have to claim it back 3 months later, because we're a small organisation. We were a small organisation I was working with then. So that access to more pooled money that we could repay would be really important as well.
Thank you. And Zoe Holliday.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about aligning and making sure that we're not duplicating what already exists, but actually looking at where the gaps are at the minute. So one really big area, which again I think we'll come on to, but is about the financing options for shared ownership, which has not really been cracked and is not currently covered. So I think that's something that we really need to be looking at. Kind of areas like project management support, post-installation support, and just this kind of longer term transparency around when fundings will take place, kind of knowing 3 years ahead, for example, what funding rounds there will be and what for, so that actually communities can work towards those. And that's also a kind of, I suppose, a justice issue, because the problem with these stop-start programmes is, in general, what happens is that the communities that are already in the process of developing projects are then able to jump onto those funding rounds and access them, and the communities that don't have the capacity, don't have development officers in post, haven't got to the stage of having a kind of fully fleshed out project, miss out on that round kind of time and time again, because they don't have the resource to put into it in the hopes of something coming up that matches with it. And I would echo as well the point about kind of taking a whole systems approach as well, and looking at how do these match in with other things like heating, flexibility and so on as well.
Okay, thanks very much. And Louise, Marix Evans, why in your view would extending local power plan funding to community heat networks better reflect the government's ambition for community energy in its Clean Power 2030 action plan?
Because we've got to decarbonise the grid, yes, and we're going to have much more demand on the grid. We know that, so we need flexibility and more generation. But as we decarbonise heat, we need to come up with ways to do that work in dense urban areas with smaller homes. And that could be a small heat network like boreholes. Sorry, I'm miming. That's not very good for whoever's writing something down, is it? Boreholes connected with shared ambient loops connected into the houses, so that decarbonises the heat, plus the PV on the roofs, so that you form a little mini energy system down streets. Much easier to deploy than a great big heat network, and currently the heat networks aren't serving domestic, unless they're existing heat networks, but under heat network zoning that doesn't come in. So I think there's a chance that we have tunnel vision about clean power, and we're not thinking about how it touches ordinary people in houses who it doesn't mean much to, but if your house is improved and your heating is changed, and it's done on a community scale by nice local people, and they're there to stay, then I think you bring people with you, but it contributes to the clean power piece, because you're delivering, if you did the 6 million terraced houses that we could potentially do, you're delivering 12 gigawatts of flexibility to the clean power mission people. So it all ties together. And it is complex, so hard to explain, but yeah.
No, that's very helpful, thank you. We'll move on to some of the current coordination challenges, and Torquil Crichton's got some questions.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome all. Forgive my voice, it's in my boots. I was going to ask questions about the role of local authorities, but before I do, Marna, what you mentioned about communities of interest as well as communities of place, I think you'll recognise a community when you see one. But this idea of community of interest could, of course, mean that municipalities, councils could be a community of interest.
We work with local councils. We've got projects with local councils.
Yeah.
And we work with developers, with councils, with landowners, obviously with communities, because our aim is just to make projects happen.
Yeah.
How do you make projects happen? I was just going to say that I think this is a very easy business to burn through a lot of money and not get anywhere. My biggest file on my laptop is abortive projects. So when it's the taxpayers' money, I think we need to be quite careful about where it goes. We at the moment are doing projects where we put solar panels on roofs of buildings and we sell effectively to the host building. So they get their electricity cheaper, the members get a return on their investment, everybody's happy. But if we have to sell to the grid, the financial model doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So there's obviously a case for, if you want those projects that don't work in that way, there has to be some underpinning of the price. But I think it's a question about where do we get most bang for the taxpayer's buck, and being quite selective about the kinds of things that the taxpayer's money supports.
Okay. Speaking of money, Zoe and Louise, you've both proposed that GB Energy attaches conditions to funding grants that require local authorities to work with community energy groups. Why did you raise these concerns? What issues do you have?
Is it?
Zoe.
Yep. Sorry. If I may, firstly, if I can just respond quickly to the previous point about local authorities and different groups doing energy. While I recognise that for the energy transition we're going to have all kinds of scales and types of projects, I do think that, coming back to the definition issue, we do need to have separate definitions for what is municipal energy, what is local energy and what's community energy, and we need to see them as different and recognise that the impacts of those are very different in terms of the actual impacts that community-led projects have on their local area and the amount of income and impact on the economy that those have. And I think that is really important that we don't conflate them, because that's what's happened in Scotland. We have a local and community energy target, and right now community energy is only 10% of what is currently counted towards that target. The vast majority of the target is currently farms and estates and local businesses, which do not have the same impact locally. So I just want to kind of make that clear before I answer that question, sorry. In terms of requiring local authorities to work with community groups, I think, obviously there's a real emphasis throughout the GB Energy and the local power plan on looking at local authorities. And again, I think it's just really important that the money doesn't just go directly to local authorities and fill black holes in their funding, but that the money is going to communities as well. And I think that we've seen really good examples. If we look back 2 decades, Orkney Council decided to fund development officers on every island in Orkney. Not every island, sorry, nine development officers, and of those 9 development officers, 7 ended up taking projects forward with community energy, 6 on their own and 1 shared ownership project. And the impact that that's had on those communities is absolutely profound. They have their own income streams. They now fund their own development officers and have done for a number of years. And they actually recently turned down funding to have further officers because they could fund them themselves. So, taking that kind of opportunity to work with community groups and build up their own capacities. So we'd like to see, a community energy officer within every council to be kind of acting as the contact point for communities and coordinating with kind of relevant other departments within the council, but also to be kind of taking, leading the way, offering a shared ownership with their own projects, offering their roofs and land up for community energy projects, because, why not lead? That's their role.
Do you see an appetite for that elsewhere in Scotland or elsewhere across the UK? That Orkney example, do you see other people want to get on to do that? Louise, you say you do.
Are you asking me or?
One of you will do, or Jay.
I think some of the best examples of community energy enterprises operating at scale across the UK are collaborations between local energy enterprises and local authorities, and I can name a few. Bath and West Community Energy has had a collaboration agreement with their local authority from the beginning. I'm a volunteer trustee of Plymouth Energy Community, which was set up following a manifesto commitment from a councillor as a standalone body, but their success has very much been to do with an ongoing close relationship with that council, and that's what's enabled them to set up an energy advice service which is helping 2,000 households a year. They employ 30 people. They've got a turnover of over £3 million from generation and energy advice services. And they are, for 4 years, so I'm coming to the challenge now, for 4 years we've been working on a 13 megawatt solar farm, a site called Chelsea Meadow, being developed as a joint venture, 50-50 joint venture between Plymouth Energy Community and Plymouth City Council. And it should be the perfect example of a council-community collaboration. It's a former landfill site owned by the council. The project's been developed in a 50-50 joint venture. The council receives the land rent. The council wants to purchase the power. The council's willing to put in finance backed by public sector works board borrowing, but it's very difficult to get it to work, and nearly 5 years in, we're still not sure if it's going to get built. So the principle definitely, but there needs to be some business models fixed to help more of those projects get over the line.
Thank you. Louise, you've got quite a lot of experience in this with net zero terrace streets. What are the top tips? What can we learn from that experience?
Well, I think that councils tend to have quite a minor role in the energy system generally. There's not much, a bit of permitting. There will be some work around heat zoning, and then the regional energy system planner will be a role probably at combined authority level. Lots of them talk about local energy markets and haven't yet set them up or been able to set them up. So there's a lot of ambition. But then community energy has quite a strong role where it can come in, like Jake's illustrated. And I'd add to that Oxford Low Carbon Hub, where you've got the delivery and then the innovation. But many councils lack capacity, so Rossendale wouldn't be doing this without Rossendale Valley Energy. So by working together, we've given them more capacity, and they've given us a home and some houses to practice on, as it were, to demonstrate the scheme on. But then we've also got this, I think it's like, it's just stronger doing things in a partnership. So you've got the different skills that come together, the agility of the community energy sector to go, right, this is a problem, how do we solve it? And staying in that area rather than just going where the market will go. So there's been a lot of innovation that we've done over the last 3 years with them, a lot of learning, and we've got loads of other local authorities and community energy groups lined up to learn from us. And then to that I would add is, how do we help people understand where we're going in the energy system? So we've got community energy groups developing community-led energy planning that docks up into local area energy plans, which are rather top level and lack detail. So we have that in Oldham with Carbon Co-op, and we have that in Essex County Council as well. So we've got that sort of what the energy transition means from the ground up, which community energy often has the ability to explain and engage on, and then that can speak into the people at the local authority or combined authority level and start to develop some really exciting projects as well.
We move on to incentivising shared ownership.
I agree, and I'm conscious of the time as well, Chair. I mean, net zero won't happen without, the muscle of private companies and the backing of government, but importantly, the consent of communities. And the quickest way to get community buy-in is shared ownership. And I just want to ask the panel what incentives commercial developers should do, offer shared ownership for energy projects for communities, like a 20% buy-in, would that improve planning quicker, with contracts for difference qualifications, get through quicker if they offer community ownership? You, Lucas, you want to start?
I would say the biggest thing that would incentivise the developers is probably priority on the grid.
Yeah.
Because everybody wants the grid and people can't get it. There's a massive queue of projects, and if you were to say, if you do this for the community, then you are bumped up the queue for the grid. That might actually make a difference.
Do you think there should be a derogation then for schemes that have a community element, or even 100% community element?
I don't know how you do it, but I kind of think that principle is a good principle if you can find a way to make it work. I think the other thing, I mean, if you don't have the developers bought into the idea of community ownership, there will be backsliding and gaming as has happened in the past. People use what is available to advance their own interests. So it's got to be very well designed and thought through.
Zoe, what's your sorry, I was going to go to Zoe first to ask what your experience was from Scotland, then I'll come to you, Jay.
So I think the number one thing that I would say is that guidance isn't enough. In Scotland, we've had guidance for a number of years and it hasn't had the impact that I think it should have done. Currently, only 0.2% of Scotland's wind power is owned by communities, and we've seen kind of positive statements from both the Scottish Government and the UK government, going back more than a decade, and we haven't seen the impact that should have done. So I think for us, shared ownership offers should be mandatory, but as you say, there can be kind of other incentives like priority in the grid. We've been calling for there to be a criteria for designating community-owned energy and storage projects, and as well as derogations where relevant. And I think that we could be looking at that also depending on the kind of percentage of shared ownership. Likewise in planning, which obviously we have to recognise is devolved, so it would need to go through multiple planning systems, but the ownership should be a material consideration, and again on a hierarchy which gives kind of most credit to fully owned community projects, and then less to sort of depending on what the percentage of shared ownership is, and also that shared ownership should be a condition for government support for things like CFDs, and also projects that are taking place on government-owned land. In Scotland, for example, Forestry and Land Commission land, there's an awful lot of projects that...
So basically saying the guidelines approach hasn't worked.
No.
There should be a mandatory approach. So if GB Energy is going to be investing in lots of these schemes, should there be kind of minimum obligations for community share in schemes that GB Energy finances?
Yeah, so we think it should be 20% should be offered to communities. Mm-hmm. And I think that, we need to actually be thinking about the fact that this is not just about new projects that are coming on, this is about projects that are already going through the system, because the reality is that if the 2030 target is to be achieved, we're talking about projects that are already in kind of going through various planning and consent processes, so this needs to be kind of considered and done quite quickly. So
20% offer to get GB Energy money, grid connections quicker, there's a community element. Jake, what's your...
I think we're saying 20% in all projects would be the underlying thing, and for this to... I agree with Zoe that guidance hasn't worked, but there was a brief period in 2015-16 when there was a policy with teeth under the split feed-in tariff policy where suddenly an awful lot of shared ownership happened, and it ended with the end of the feed-in tariff. So that proves that where there is a policy that in that case provides a positive incentive for developers and communities to engage in shared ownership, underpinned by, in that case it was a Hobson's choice, if they didn't turn half their project into a community scheme it would not be built, then an awful lot happened. I think 100 megawatts probably came out of that policy over a space of 2 years. Mm-hmm. So to work, it needs to be underpinned by some sort of right to buy that could be implemented through the Infrastructure Act, but then there needs to be a positive platform where both communities and developers want to do this, and the rest of the panel have set out some suggestions of what makes it work for both sides. There's got to be some carrots for the developer, maybe points in the grid queue, points in CFD queue, some kind of ongoing benefit, perhaps it's business rates. There has to be some upside for them. Yeah. For the community, they need to be sure that they're going to come out of it with a project that is financially profitable, because that's the whole point of it. I think there needs to be some kind of price setting mechanism where both parties have certainty over the price of the deal, that if the community can raise the money, they know it's going to work financially, and they know they can see the transaction through. And I think it's the best opportunity for GB Energy to deploy capital at scale and generate a profit that could, some of that could be used to subsidise more marginal community developed projects.
Great, thanks. Jake, just very quickly, you talked about the right to buy, the community right to buy in that 2015 Infrastructure Act.
So in the 2015 Infrastructure Act has given the Secretary of State powers to create a a right to buy mechanism in the well, it's in the 2015 Act, so the powers are there, and they can now be implemented by the Secretary of State. And there's
never been used, have they?
Never been used, no. And I think the logic at the time was, let's see how guidance goes. The guidance hasn't gone anywhere, so let's implement those powers.
I can give you a response. The UK gave a response to the Shared Ownership Task Force saying that we expect that by 2015 it will become the norm for communities to be offered some level of ownership of new commercially developed onshore renewable projects. We'll review progress in 2015, and if this is limited, we will consider requiring all developers to offer the opportunity of a shared ownership element to communities. So we're about 10 years overdue on that.
Okay, thank you.
Right, you're on to your section of questions.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up slightly on a couple of those things. Firstly, I'm interested in understanding, if we were to incentivise shared ownership, how that would accelerate the deployment of levels of clean energy generation at scale for us to hit the 2030 target. How much would this particular set of recommendations that you're putting forward help us achieve that target?
If it's shared ownership of projects that are already in the pipeline, it's not going to produce additional large-scale megawatts. But what it will do is put a percentage of those large-scale megawatts into community energy, where the surplus profits are being reinvested in doing the hard-to-do stuff. So it's providing communities with a profitable anchor asset that is the foundation for a viable local energy enterprise that can do all the hard-to-do stuff, which is what the government has wanted from community energy for a long time, but it's very difficult unless they've got a means of income and ideally power to do it.
Can I follow up as well on that? I've always been interested in the idea of shared ownership because of my scepticism that developers are nice guys. Funnily enough, I just don't think that's necessarily the case. So why should they? And why should a community be confident in going into shared ownership with a developer who has big fat lawyers and loads of money and very good ability to be able to write lots of small print, when frankly community energy groups tend to be spending their spare time doing this and are not necessarily experts?
This is where I think we need to have protections, and we also need to have things like standardised templates for agreements so that there is a good practice. But we do need to have protections, like, for example, obviously it's quite common for private developments to change hands. We need to make sure that communities have the right to keep their stake in a project at the point that it changes hands, because otherwise there's a risk that a few years down the line, the developer decides to sell up and the community loses their stake, which has been an example that's happened in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Can I have one more question before I move on to the financing issue? The question of the equitable nature of community energy, I'm particularly interested in, especially since we've talked about the difference between municipal energy and community energy. Especially when we've been talking about raising money and stakes in it and so forth. A lot of the people, I need to declare an interest. I've worked with Louise before. I've actually commissioned her to do research in my previous job. So it's worthwhile making sure that's on the record before I go any further. But I'm interested to know from you, Louise, how you might see the conditions that we could put around community energy to ensure that there was an equitable approach, so that it's not just the communities with money that get to have these benefits, but that also we use it to tackle some of the built-in inequalities that we've got in our energy system.
That's what we're trying to do here, to say we could set up a scheme where we've got private investment going into the infrastructure, and we're somehow wrapping around the hard-to-do retrofit part, and that we put some kind of profit or gain share cap on it, so it's not their scheme, it's the community's scheme that they're investing in. So it's flipped the other way round. Rather than the wind farm letting the community own a bit, this is saying, we'll let you invest in this and we will give you enough return to attract your investment, but we will be asset locked, and if you sell or refinance, then we'll put a gain share on it. I mean, we're at an early stage, so we may not get investors. We may get social impact investors who want to make a difference in these areas. this is all up for grabs, and it's part of the ongoing place-based investment conundrum everyone's trying to solve. So we're trying to look at how we would do that. And we're looking at models of how you would do that. Also looking at that in Oldham with what you can do around community. Can communities become like a co-op? As a co-op buyer, you become a member. And I would say there are examples, though, aren't there, of more deprived areas which do have successful community energy organisations. Thinking of Repowering London, for example, which really bring in a younger generation as well. So it's not just to say it is just leafy middle class loveliness, run just by volunteers. And I think I've got some numbers somewhere. There's something like 800 employees, but 3,500 community energy volunteers. That's the way.
I spoke to my colleagues in the Netherlands where they are already doing compulsory shared ownership. And the way they do it is the community comes in right at the beginning and they pay their share of the funding as the project is developed. Because if you leave it to buy it once the project is developed at market value, most community financial models do not work on market value. There's not enough cash in the model in the early years to make it work. So they are getting funding to do that early stage. When it gets to the operational point, they go and refinance with a public offer so that ordinary members of the public can participate, but that early stage funding and that insisting on really you're buying at cost because you're paying as you go, that is fundamental to their model.
Great, so that goes on to my point about financing shared ownership. How should the government and Great British Energy help communities access finance to participate in shared ownership? Should, for example, Great British Energy be doing that early stage development work you're talking about?
Well, this is where, in a system where it is compulsory for the developers to do that. So if we make that assumption, then obviously yes.
If it wasn't compulsory?
If it wasn't compulsory, what projects is it going to finance? I think you need to look at the kinds of projects that it's going to finance.
Conditions on it. What kind of conditions would you think will be worthwhile putting on in order to be able to make sure that the British taxpayers' money, which is in GB Energy, is being used for good purpose, on good outcomes?
Well, who are you lending to would be step one. Who are you lending to? Are they a bona fide community organisation? What are their principles? Who are involved? And then I think you make them pay it back into the pot at whatever is a reasonable rate, and you put conditions about what they spend any profit on.
Yeah, I'm just going to be a bit rude here, but I can't imagine Whitehall being particularly good at making those judgments. What do you think?
Possibly.
You're almost as polite as I am.
There's also a question which you've touched on here in this exchange, which is how do you ensure that you have people with the right intentions over an extended period of time, and how do you build that into the model?
That is really difficult, but essentially in our organisations we set up cooperatives and societies for the benefit of the community, and we trust the members. The members must be active and ensure that the society is acting in accordance with what it was set up to do. One member, one vote, it's democratic. They need to be active and take part and ensure that happens. If they don't, it's a problem. Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I feel like I've just jumped ahead of you. Sorry, Jake. I was going to say, I think, firstly, just in terms of this conversation, I think it is really important to delineate between investor clubs and share offers, because those are very different things, and we're not promoting investor clubs as being community energy. We're, again, not trying to kind of just line the pockets of people who are richer, and kind of the benefits of a community energy project needs to benefit everyone, and there are ways of setting up co-ops or using other models like the development trust model that's been used mostly in Scotland, whereby everyone in the community has a say in what happens, but also has the opportunity to benefit from the project. So that's just kind of on that. I think we had proposed in our response, and I know that a number of other organisations have had similar ideas, that we think that there is a real space for GB Energy to kind of come up with innovative financial models to fill the gaps. And one of the ideas is the idea that at the earliest stage, again, kind of before we're talking about commercial market rates, GB Energy takes, for example, a 20% stake in every private development, with the idea that they then pass it on later they transform those into loan agreements for the communities later at the point that the communities had the chance to build up their capacity and interest.
Is that a bit like your buyer of last resort idea, Jake?
Sorry, say that again, Polly?
Is that a bit like that Great British Energy should temporarily act as buyer of last resort? Can you explain that a bit more?
It's a huge opportunity for GB Energy, and it plays to the equality point that if shared ownership projects can happen wherever there is a viable project. So if there is not a established local energy organisation in that locality able to step forward and take the stake, if GB Energy takes that stake on behalf of the community, either short-term or potentially long-term, the protection comes from that stake being taken by a not-for-profit company that has a local benefit purpose written into its objects, and it's set up to generate surplus income to serve the local community, and the GB Energy finance is the means to the end of that happening.
Okay. Zoe and Marna, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what features of the Scottish Government's CARES scheme that, Zoe, I know you mentioned earlier, have made it more successful at supporting shared ownership than equivalent schemes in England.
So in Scotland they have had a couple of full-time officers working to support communities with shared ownership for the last, certainly the last 4 years of the programme, and I think, having that support to reach out to kind of relevant communities when there's opportunities come up for shared ownership and to kind of speak through them, I think that's been a real opportunity. But I think, even those officers themselves would say it has been kind of a big struggle, partly just because it takes a long time for these projects to come through. There are now kind of a number of offers on the table, but I think, there are still not, huge numbers. Most of the examples that we have are with kind of smaller, more motivated, say, for example, landowners who decided that they wanted to benefit the local community when they were taking forward projects. There are not many projects which kind of have the big developer names who are offering shared ownership at a meaningful stake until now. So I think even those teams would kind of acknowledge the need to have more carrots and more sticks to get developers involved, because as I said, we're still currently a genuine community owned shared ownership stakes are sitting just under, I spoke to them yesterday, just under 20 megawatts in Scotland. So it's it's a reasonable amount, but it's nowhere near what it could be if we were talking about significant stakes of projects. And there have been unfortunate examples where huge stakes have fallen through because of various reasons, including the Viking project in Shetland, which is a big loss to the shared ownership opportunities. Mm-hmm.
Anna?
We've had a very good experience with CARES. We tend to be their policy of last resort. They come to us if they can't get a project away in other ways, is our impression. But the amount of funding is excellent for smaller schemes, but for larger schemes, the cap on the funding means that you will spend all that money, and then what? And then what? Because then you come to a halt. How do you then advance that project if there's no money to pay the next round of whatever it is you need to pay?
I'm also wondering, you talked about 20 megawatts of shared ownership in Scotland, is that right? Mm-hmm. I'm wondering whether, and going to your point about the fact that what community ownership can do that other people can't is the difficult bits, which is very important for us in terms of the warm homes plan and all those kind of things, and demand management. Has there been any modelling of those community projects? They're generating 20 megawatts, but they're saving X number of megawatts as well. They're reducing demand by whatever. They're making the energy use in the particular community smarter. Is that modelling being done? Is that a way of making it more compelling to either the developers or the state in supporting those kind of projects?
There has been some research. We've also, as part of the Energy Learning Network, tried to look at the social impacts of community energy, and we've done a recent report on that. Quite a lot of the communities hold information, and it hasn't all been aggregated, so that's something we're looking at right now. I should say the 20 megawatts is very specifically the shared ownership stake, so we're not talking about kind of community-owned projects in general. But I think, you know, when you look at the impact of community projects, it's just, I mean, just the sheer amount of money that's been kind of levered back into communities in terms of things like fuel poverty grants, in terms of things like energy efficiency support, transport programs, opening up existing assets like cafes, you know, creating new hubs for communities. So, you know, there's a report that's oft cited that 34 times as much community benefit goes back into the community on average from a community-owned project versus a privately owned project. But in some cases, it's even more stark. I mean, going back to the Viking project in Shetland, there's the Viking project, which is over 450 megawatts, and there's a project that's 100th its size in North Yell, the Garth wind farm, and they provide, on a good year, the same amount of community benefit as the project that's 100 times larger than them. So, you know, they are hugely impactful on communities, and you know, Minister Clayton can, I'm sure, speak to the kind of impact that, you know, Point and Sandwick and Goulbourne and various other community-owned wind farms have had in his constituency. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I just point out, however, that when we're talking about measuring impacts and so forth, if we've got a clean energy superpower target of 2030, many of the things that you're talking about that are community benefit are not a metric that is measured in that mission. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And making sure that community energy's other benefits, the community benefit, the community of place and so forth, will need to be produced and presented to government on metrics that will meet their other missions.
Okay, we
need to move on, so can you make a short response to that question?
I was going to say there are other ways of looking at it. It's not just that kind of whole all-encompassing thing. But so, for example, we have a project in Scunthorpe where the council has used the Towns Fund grant. We have matched it with a public share offer, and that's put solar on the roofs of schools and other public buildings in Scunthorpe. I think we'd raised £500,000 from the town's grant, and in less than a year, it saved the council £290,000 on the electricity bill. Now, that is a measurable benefit that is going back into the council's coffers to be spent on whatever the council thinks needs to be done in that local area. And that is outside of these enclosed community schemes, but it is a very clear benefit coming from community energy.
Question from Vera Hophouse, and then we're going to move on to Mike.
I've been dying to ask this question about the hard to do things. And you, Louise, you mentioned the high proportion of the private rented sector. So shared ownership, yes, you own the energy that is being produced or whatever, you get a share in the profit. But the main thing is, of course, that you should benefit in lower energy bills. How can you make that possible in a building that is not owned by you? How can you actually force a private landlord to be part of a community energy scheme if they don't want to? How can that work?
You wouldn't force them. You produce a really good reason for them to join it, because they're going to have EPCC. They want people to rent their house. They don't want the house to go mouldy and damp. So if there's a scheme going in down the street, as a landlord, and we've tested this, they'll be like, yeah, bring it on, because I don't have to invest a lot of money up front. I can pay a standing charge and then join that community scheme. So the Net Zero Terrace Street scheme is designed to be multi-tenure, and there'll be the same offer for landlords, owner-occupiers. So the building owner will be able to join the scheme, and the residents will be paying a standing charge unless it's wrapped up with your rent, in which case the landlord would cover it. So it's doing an area-based scheme where different kinds of houses are treated. They're not treated as different. They're treated. They get access to the same service.
The incentives are big enough for the landlords to come in.
That's what we're trying to work on. Yeah.
Reader.
That's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a very short period now, so we'll try and keep ourselves time. The final question that we're going to focus on is on capacity building within the community energy sector, and that's a very broad term, I know, but just help me on that as we go. Interested to understand from your perspectives what practical and financial support is needed to build capacity in the community energy sector and help professionalise it. And can I start on the right, please?
Okay, well, I think there is obviously a problem in deprived areas that are unlikely to have the kinds of skills that you need to build a renewable energy project, the engineers, the lawyers, the accountants, and therefore you need agencies to help them to do the project. The capacity building, I think, is working with those communities to enable them to own and manage that project and make the most of it in their locality. If you had a young person coming along who sees it and thinks, oh, I want to be an engineer, that's fantastic. But it's quite hard to manage that.
Louise?
Yeah, I think, you can look at the Community Energy England map Scotland, sorry, Zoe, and see where there are existing community energy organisations, and some have already got a lot of capacity, and then the sector helps each other. So there's that need for this core funding rather than just getting funding for feasibility studies that then may not go anywhere. There's a need for continuity funding, so you don't drop off the end of innovation projects as we do in November. The bridge funding, which I mentioned before too. So we've got 9.5 people in our organisation, but our contracts all end in November. So, and we don't yet have the ongoing generation that I think Bristol Community Energy, sitting behind me somewhere, we're able to talk to you about, because they're more established. So there's something about nurturing new ones, building up the ones, and providing that sort of the centralised expertise you can draw down, whether that's legal or engineering or whatever, but also peer-to-peer support to each other, and putting people in touch with people who've done it before as well, not just consultants. I mean, I've done endless feasibility studies, and some have gone somewhere and some haven't, but you can get a reliance on consultants, so you need to grow that in the grassroots. And I'd say particularly in deprived areas, let's turn it in. There's an apprenticeship in Oldham you can do.
Yeah, I'll come back to deprived areas, just cut you off there for time. Zoe, if you could focus on professionalising, anything more we can do to professionalise the sector?
I think that the reality is that the sector is probably already a lot more professional than people realise. There are a lot of, really ambitious projects going ahead, and we've got community projects that are now, looking at kind of taking ahead sort of 50 megawatt projects rather than just kind of the smaller ones. So we're not just talking about kind of small projects. I think what we need to be doing, though, is taking a two-pronged approach where we're kind of supporting those ones that already have the capacity to be accelerating and hitting those 2030 targets, and as we talked about, kind of maximising shared ownership in what's already happening, as well as supporting the community ownership that's already going through, but also spend these next 4 or 5 years looking at building up the capacity of other communities that don't currently have the capacity or the experience, and building a pipeline of projects to be coming through in that period of time. And there's a need to do kind of mapping at looking at where community energy projects already are, and doing kind of targeted interventions to fill the gaps.
And Jake, just quick, particularly on, we've heard about financial support and professionalising, but anything else practical that needs to happen?
Come back to, I agree with Zoe, the sector has been professionalised where there is a viable business model. So we need to fix the business model. And it's not just about generation, it's about retrofit and energy advice. Where there is a viable business model, the sector has been professionalised. I'll quote a figure that Bath and West gave me just before the meeting, that if we had a Bath and West community energy or a Plymouth energy community in every UK local authority area, we would have created 5,000 jobs and met the 8 gigawatt target.
Louise, I cut you off only because it was a specific question I had down, just so we capture it in kind of the order. Specific support needed to help people in more deprived parts of the country to participate in community energy. So some thoughts on that, please.
I feel a bit like we might be patronising to deprived parts of the country, and Ambition Lawrence Weston springs to mind. We've got examples of poorer areas that roll their sleeves up and get a lot of brilliant stuff done. And Repowering London was born in Brixton, and they're doing work in Newham as well. So there are, I think, taking an asset-based approach to deprived areas, but saying, okay, well, we'll make some jobs if we can't expect everyone to be volunteers, but also as volunteers, we put the blood, sweat and tears in at the weekend. So I'm here in a paid role, but I've also been a community energy director for 2 different ones and do a lot of voluntary work. So there's that balance there, isn't there, about harnessing volunteers' passion for places they believe in and really care about, and they're going to come up with a solution that works with local people, not parachuting experts in, but also saying, well, if you need access to expensive lawyers, here's a panel of community energy lawyers, you've got this much to spend on them, go away and fill your boots. Same with maybe engineers and so on. But we need to build those skills ground up, I think.
Just one more from me then. And in our evidence, we received proposals for a hub and spoke model to facilitate knowledge exchange, and you have all talked around sharing information and mapping as a critical thing here. Is there a risk, though, that a hub and spoke model could duplicate the existing work of mayoralty authorities, net zero hubs, and the energy learning network? And Louise, you should go ahead straight away, so I'll come to you first.
The Energy Learning Network is part of that hub and spoke, I'd suggest.
Okay.
The net zero hubs, it could align with them, but they aren't always community energy experts, though they may have technical expertise that they can share out. So I think it would need to sit alongside and not be a new thing that's plonked on top, because there is already that support available, but it needs to be more of it.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would agree it's about actually kind of linking these things in together. So looking at organisations that already exist to be those kind of hubs, and then actually doing things like funding knowledge sharing and mentoring, which is something that's happening on a small scale at the minute through the Energy Learning Network, looking at kind of making sure that there's kind of development officers or officers in whatever it might be, hubs or anchor organisations throughout the country, who are then able to pass on knowledge and support other groups. If I might just quickly answer the question previous as well, in terms of kind of supporting different areas, I would like to just pick up on the word volunteers. I think that's one of the biggest challenges in areas that may be more deprived, is that actually people may not be able to offer their time up for free, even if they have skills, even if, so I think that's something we really need to look at, is making sure that there is the opportunity to fund. But I think that, again, I would agree that I think being patronising towards kind of deprived areas, actually, if you look at kind of fuel poverty, probably some of the highest levels of fuel poverty are in the areas that have the most community energy in Scotland. And I think that we just need to be kind of, again, looking at kind of mapping different models that match different areas, like in kind of inner city areas. And that's where potentially things like shared ownership and offering out shared ownership to wider communities could really have a role to play.
And the final question to this panel from
the last one, because Jake and Zoe, you talked about the depth of professional knowledge that already is in the community sector. Isn't there an argument for taking that knowledge and turning it into a community energy unit within GB Energy that helps other communities that don't have that kind of capacity?
If GB Energy is there to provide finance to new projects and including shared ownership, that knowledge will be put to work.
Zoe, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think we need to maximise on all the knowledge that we have already, and be looking at where the gaps are and kind of filling those ASAP. Mm-hmm.
Thank you all.
And so, thank you very much to our first panel, to Zoe Holliday, to Jake Burnyeat, to Marna McMillin, and to Louise Marix Evans. Thank you all for your evidence. The session is suspended. Order. Order, and welcome back to the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee. We have our second panel of the afternoon on our inquiry into community energy, and as with our first panel, if you could introduce yourselves please. We will start the questioning shortly. If I start on this side.
Hello, my name is Matthew Clayton. I'm CEO of Thrive Renewables. We're a renewable energy investment company. We've been operating for 30 years in the UK. We've built or funded 44 renewable energy projects, 400 megawatts. Unite a community of over 6,000 investors, the smallest of which is £5, the largest of which is £6.5 million, into building new renewable energy projects which put people at their heart.
Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Hugh Goulbourne. I'm a director of CO2 Sense Community Interest Company. We are a small fund that invests in renewable energy projects, mainly focused on decarbonisation, but also an impact first funder. We were set up in the great county of Yorkshire with funding from a former UK government about 15 years ago, although we now have a UK remit.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Helen Martin. I'm CEO of Bristol Energy Cooperative. So we're one of those larger community energy organisations that were mentioned at the end of the last panel there, based, as you might expect, in Bristol. We have a portfolio of around 12 megawatts, consisting of 22 clean energy projects, mostly solar.
You are all very welcome. We look forward to your evidence, and the questions will start with Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the panel. Could you just tell the committee in a few sentences what you think the biggest challenge is facing community energy, starting with Helen?
Of course. So from the perspective of the community energy organisation, I think the biggest challenge was sort of hinted at on the previous panel, and that is really putting together a viable project. And so I guess we may come back to some aspects of this, but I think of that, the biggest challenge is the lack of a pricing mechanism that reflects the value of what we do. And so that's building local generation in and around where people live, putting a reduced strain on the grid, providing opportunities for local balancing, getting resources back into the system to do the hard stuff, as we've talked about, as well as the less tangible benefits of bringing people along with the energy transition. So we're building tiny assets, but when we try and bring those assets onto the grid, we have to compete on a more or less like-for-like basis with massive offshore wind projects. And that obviously is really hard to make that add up. So I think that is the biggest challenge we have. It is also not like-for-like, because whereas larger renewable energy generators are able to participate, for example, in the contracts for difference mechanism to be able to get some price stability over the lifetime of the project, that starts from 5 megawatts. So that's out of the range of most community energy projects, which creates a big issue for us in trying to raise finance, being able to achieve a degree of price stability over the lifetime of the projects. You could ask, why don't we scale up? Of course, there's limitations on that in terms of our ability to access grid connections at a reasonable scale on a reasonable time frame, given that we want to be involved in the project right from the beginning through to the end. Until recently, and until we hope this may be changing, but that has basically, for our own projects that we're developing, meant we have been constrained to a size of less than 1 megawatt, which is the scale at which we are able to access a grid connection without going through the queue process, which we've already talked to. And then, of course, the challenges of funding and resourcing project development. At Bristol Energy Cooperative, we're lucky enough to have a small staff team and to have assets off the back of which we are able to invest in project development. But for larger projects, and of course for smaller community energy organisations, that remains a huge barrier, which we've talked about in the previous panel.
Thanks very much. But just to be clear, you think sort of pricing is the
business model? Like, I think this came up in the last panel as well. The pricing and the business model.
You?
I guess we come at this from the angle of finance, right? So what we see with community energy projects is most of the ones we see are quite small, probably sort of sub 1 megawatt, less than £500,000 worth of investment. And from a financial perspective, you know, the costs of investing in a small project like that for an investor are just the same as they are for a large project. So some of the projects we were talking about in the first session, where you're looking at 40, 50, 60 million pounds, it's the same amount of due diligence and other work you have to do to invest in that as you have to in a £500,000 project. So, and also it's important to remember that the return on investment on this is not double-digit figures. So for investors, going into community energy at a small scale is difficult and probably not very attractive. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. That's why we, as I think we put in our submission, are trying to pull together some investors to put together a new fund which would invest in small-scale community energy and would therefore help Bristol Energy Cooperative and others to install more projects and for more community energy projects to come forward. This would also help to solve a problem on the investor side, because when we talk to high net worth individuals, to family offices, to foundations, the mandate that they have means that they sort of lack the time to look at these smaller community energy projects, to look at the community shares that are put out through SX, Abundance and other platforms and bond offers. And so our fund is in part also to address that problem, the investor side problem, which is a lack of time and a lack of resource to look at these smaller projects. And that's leaving aside the fact that if you're a high net worth individual, if you take on bonds and shares and other things, you've also then got to go through all the pain of doing all your tax returns and everything for each individual project, which is quite unattractive to an investor. This then creates also, because there's not that pool of investors, because they're put off and disincentivized, this also then creates significant delays for the community energy projects themselves to raise finance. So if you're doing a crowd platform share, it might take 6 months, 12 months typically, sometimes less. But that's a long time if you're trying to raise finance for an oven-ready project where you've got planning and other things and you want to get to construction in the next 2 or 3 months. And so it's just sort of halting that pipeline of projects coming through. And raising the finance, in effect, is then the problem because investors are not really ready to put that funding in. So our new fund aims to solve that problem. We want to pool investments from, as I say, high net worths, family offices and foundations, and remove the administrative burden by aggregating lots and lots of small projects into one investment vehicle.
You've anticipated some of our questions on finance inevitably, I think, but carry on.
Matthew?
Yeah, I think I'd agree that the principal challenge, I mean, I guess the challenges for community energy can't be isolated from the challenges for all renewable energy projects in the UK at the moment. There's an issue around the revenue levels, the cost of capital, and where the capex is. So the business model has become a very thin one for any project, but that's exacerbated at two levels for a community energy group. One, principally because of scale. So if you're looking sub 5 megawatts, then you can't use the CFD. If you can't use the CFD, then effectively you're projecting a 21% lower revenue curve for the next 25 years relative to allocation round 6. And in addition to that, your access to debt is both more expensive and the amount of gearing you can put into a project is reduced because you haven't got the revenue certainty. So, yeah, I'd calculate that effectively a renewable energy project being developed without the CFD, because you're already accepting a 21% lower revenue curve, and then your cost of debt is putting an extra 1 or 2% on the burden on the project, and each 1 or 2% or each 1% is effectively translates to about £7 requirement on the electricity price. So you're kind of, by the time you stack all that up, you're probably looking at about 2/3 of the value of a commercially developed project, which is tough to work with.
I suspect I'm probably approaching time, but is the answer a bespoke pricing mechanism?
Well, there's obviously different ways you could go about addressing this. I mean, we started off with the feed-in tariff, and most of our assets, like many community energy organisations, were built under that regime, which offered us both a subsidy and a floor price for the electricity that we exported from those projects to the grid. So that's one option. I mean, we have been managing to build projects recently. We've built about 1.5 megawatts of solar, new rooftop solar in the last 18 months with basically small grants provided in our case by the West of England Combined Authority, which has been really supportive of community energy. And what those have allowed us to do is, because with a rooftop solar installation, you have the potential to sell on site without going into the grid. And so that does generate a much higher price. But then you need to typically shape the size of the asset to meet the on-site demand, whereas with a little bit of grant funding that allows us to max out the size of the asset while we're up there, if you like, future-proofing against growth in demand in the future and also exporting to the grid despite lower than normal prices. So that's been hugely valuable. But fundamentally for us, I think what we would like to see is a pricing that is built into and part of a right to local supply. And so that could be Firstly, there needs to be a right to do that. That would require the participation of licensed suppliers to allow us to sell our power to local customers at a price that both improves the return for us and allows us to offer discounted power to people who are using electricity at the same time we're generating it. And so that would, at the moment, we have very limited capacity to actually deliver the matched local supply and demand that what is where we really think we would like to be, as well as offer that benefit. That's a whole other different way that we could connect with consumers. That's what people always ask us. Oh, you're building a community energy asset on the rooftop next door. Does that mean I can get a discount on my bills? And we would love to be able to say yes. So that's where we would really like to see things go, and that could be achieved. There are some mechanisms that are sort of in the works that would get towards that, around reducing some of the non-commodity charges that get loaded onto energy bills in the case of matched supply and demand, and particularly where that's local. I can go into more detail if you like, but there are some that is what we'd like to really unlock. I imagine you don't have time for that. We can share afterwards, perhaps.
Please write to us in more detail.
We'll definitely do that.
Mike Reed has got a question that I think may well be quite well timed on the back.
We're going to ask more generally, are there any other government incentives or mechanisms that are in consultation that would help bring forward more community energy schemes? And actually, to add to that, is there any learning we should do from outside the UK on incentives or mechanisms that have helped really drive community energy in other countries?
Well, I mean, I guess that does immediately follow what I was saying, which is there are a couple of adaptations to the grid code which are either about to be implemented or under consideration that would get a large way to what I'm saying. One of those is P442, which allows small-scale generators to be exempt from certain levies when they can demonstrate that their supply is matching the offtake for a particular user. That does have limitations because it is only available for up to 5 megawatts for any given entity, and for a larger community energy organisation like Bristol Energy Co-op, we would already be surpassing that. So it has limitations. It's also not linked to geography. There is another modification, P441, which is in the works, which is trying to introduce a further mechanism which would link that to proximity, so under a given substation, balancing supply and demand and reducing certain tariffs certain levies accordingly. I think the key thing for us is that those things are clear and that they are reliable, so that we know that we can make a 25, 30, 40-year investment on the basis of that tariff mechanism remaining in place over the long term.
When you say reliable, you mean as in the government won't change?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Claire Young, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think some of the questions I was going to ask about guaranteed minimum prices for electricity you've probably already covered to some extent, and it's certainly something that's come up in my patch when I talk to Marshfield Community Energy. But specifically, in terms of achieving 8 gigawatts by 2030, do you think that price certainty alone would be enough to unlock that, or the other things you've been talking about, would they also be necessary for that specific goal?
I think if we look back over the last 25 years, we can see the periods where the most capacity has been built has been when there's been price certainty. So under the feed-in tariff, particularly for the community energy space, on the Renewables obligation scheme, you can see the deployment curve completely tracks the certainty or otherwise which was given around revenues on that. But I guess in today's context, I don't think that the sector, renewables is becoming mainstream energy, so I don't think the sector should be looking for any more revenue support than, the community energy sector shouldn't necessarily need more revenue support, but it needs access to the existing revenue support. But I guess if you look at a renewable energy project, you've got roughly 3 sources of value. You've got the dynamics of value is the revenue side, the capital cost side, and your cost of capital side. They're effectively your 3 limbs. So revenue support, a premium for CFD, or just access to the CFD would be obviously be a very helpful step in terms of revenue. On the capex side, I mean, I don't propose that we change the pricing of turbines and panels for community energy. However, given that the very material element that the grid makes up of the capex requirement, then perhaps GB Energy could routinely own the grid infrastructure for community energy, which community energy can then amortise the cost of that over 3 or 4 life cycles of a project, so over 60, 70 years instead of 25 years, which is a real albatross around the projects next. And then the cost of capital, I think anything that can be done with GB Energy to provide either a lower cost slice of capital or some kind of softer capital slice to complement the commercial money coming in, just to take the edge off into viability, would be very welcome. So I think it doesn't have to be revenue, it could be any one of those legs of the stool or a combination of all three.
So you've mentioned Great British Energy here, and you've got an amazing ability to answer my questions before I ask them, which I have to say is astonishing. So they've got £1 billion of funding for the local power plan. You've mentioned a number of ways that they could use that. How would they use it most strategically to help reduce development and capital expenditure?
I'm happy to go first. Well, I think building on Matthew's point, one element of it would be to reduce the cost of capital, so some form of soft loans or quasi-equity or something of that kind, particularly at the riskier end of projects. You know, the private sector investor is going to invest at the near stage of a project, and by that I mean pretty much post-planning and onwards. It's too risky before that. So somebody's going to have to come in and take a lot of the pain out for community energy groups before then. Mm-hmm. And also the cost of capital to community energy groups before then, if they go out to market, is going to be a lot more than it will be once you're into planning. So I think the only person who can intervene in a meaningful way in that is the state, and there's examples of that over many, many years, that's where the state's money would be best spent. So I'd have thought GB Energy would be well placed to invest at that stage. I think then also building on that, one of the other ways in which, I mean, Helen's touched upon sort of local energy markets and local access. I think that is quite an important thing, an area to intervene as well. And I think GB Energy could certainly be, I suppose I'd say it in one way, if they're not doing that, then what are they doing as an institution? Because they're not an energy supplier, and they're not going to be building out lots and lots of big generation, because that's what commercial developers do. So you kind of have to question, what is GB Energy doing if they're not intervening in that space? And I suppose from the final point from our perspective, and I'm sure you'll come on for more questions on that, but from our perspective, GB Energy can also help to de-risk some private investment and help to crowd more private investment into the space, because again, private investors will tend to want to know that if some of these projects don't quite succeed, they're not going to have to be the people who take all of the risk on that.
Did you want to add anything, Helen?
No, I think the piece that the only place where I would add something is on that early stage development. So I think it came up in the previous panel that there is something of a gap at the moment. There has been, and we hope that there will continue to be funding for early stage feasibility testing and project development work under the Community Energy Fund, and that has been instrumental in our ability to start investing again in developing ground mount projects. But the total funding available under that at the moment is 140,000. That doesn't come anywhere close to the funding required to develop a project even of 4 or 5 megawatts, which is, as I think Jake mentioned before, closer to 300,000 or 400,000. And so there is a gap there where, as Hugh says, we can't borrow for that. It's too high risk. That sort of abandons us at the moment somewhere in the middle of planning typically. And so there are some other grant sources out there that we are aiming to tap. But if the fundamental business model, the pricing, the price stability is fixed, then that cost ultimately, I mean, literally in our accounts, that's built into the capital cost of the project. So that cost could be repaid once the project successfully reaches financial close. So I think that is a big impact investment that could be made by the likes of GB Energy, as having some kind of revolving fund for project development that could take risk, but that could be repayable when a project is successfully financed.
If I can just come back to you, Helen, you sort of referred earlier tangentially to local energy clubs.
Yeah.
How could, if there was a simpler way to set up local energy clubs so that more communities could benefit from local renewables. How could this help community energy groups raise finance for new projects? And is that something you'd see that Great British Energy should be involved in anyway?
I think local energy clubs was more or less what I was getting at with respect to having a mechanism, a right for local supply. The biggest barriers to that at the moment are, well, as I said, there are developments in the works that could create, and we could probably do better if we were starting from scratch to design the ideal approach to this, that could create the basis for essentially a price advantage. And that price advantage is the key thing. That can get, so as in, that will remove levies, certain levies from electricity that's sold by a generator to a member of a local club who's immediately adjacent or in the local area. And as soon as you've got that sort of price advantage, then that offers us the possibility of an increased revenue from that project, which helps make that project financially viable and bankable. And it also obviously offers, by allowing us to offer incentives to customers to participate. And so that's really key. I think the key things that we need for that are, first of all, that clarity on or movement on those pricing mechanisms and the levies, so that's a regulatory issue, and also some kind of requirement for suppliers to participate. Because the one really active local supply club organiser, if you like, Energy Local, that has got, there are several existing clubs happening at the moment. At the moment, there is only one supplier who will offer that service, and that supplier is a very green supplier that happens to already have relatively higher tariffs than the market norms. So that means while you can get a discount from their normal tariffs by participating in the club, those tariffs are probably higher than the big suppliers. And so while some of the bigger suppliers have supported those clubs in the past, they're not actively supporting them now. So that is the other piece. I think most of what would be needed to enable local power clubs and local supply to happen is regulatory, rather than GB Energy's investment.
Thank you for that. And we will move on to Mike Reader to ask you about locational pricing.
Sorry, slightly different tack. We're just trying to work out how we got this into this session. We've been talking a lot about locational pricing, sort of more macro issue that is currently under review, and I'd make the observation that every morning I listen to Politico London Playbook, the advert was locational pricing will stall clean energy, it's the wrong thing to do, and I heard that for a good week whilst I was listening to the Playbook every morning. But I'd be interested to hear your views on how locational pricing could help or hinder community energy projects, and if you have a view on that. And I'll start on the right with Helen.
I mean, I can answer this as Bristol Energy Cooperative, so located in a highly populated and high demand area. So obviously, locational pricing that's based on sort of the demand, the level of demand in a particular geography would obviously help us. That's a very, that is from our perspective on the system. I don't have a more global view.
I think if locational pricing comes into this general changes in regulation that enable local energy markets, then our view is that would almost break our model, because the scale of the community energy sector would go off the graph. So we're very supportive of the idea of local generation having a local market and a local set of pricing.
This might be an unhelpful response, but I think that the prevailing uncertainty is the issue rather than the eventual destination. I think the way that any change in the system in terms of locational pricing is applied, whether that's applied retrospectively or not, whether it's grandfathering or not, is a very material concern at the moment. And so, I think that the prevailing uncertainty is materially compromising the appetite of developers, commercial or community, in the UK at the moment. So resolving that uncertainty would be...
I should say for the record, it's an advert from SSE rather than Politico themselves saying that.
Great, we'll move on. Thank you very much.
Idea.
Vera Hophouse.
Thank you. And before I move on to my a section about the community energy sector being more attractive to investors and going a little bit more in the detail, I do want to go back to what, Helen, you said around the regulatory changes, because one of the the known barriers to community energy are the high connection costs to the transmission network, When community energy doesn't go beyond the local distribution network, and therefore that is a known barrier. And feeds into what you've been talking about, that you cannot sell directly locally, or it works best, community energy works best when you just have it on the rooftop, you sell it back to the school, and then beyond you can't. So what would be a way around that? Because those are these high transition costs, costs that are linked to that you have to buy into the high costs of the transmission network, rather than actually just having using the local network, and that would be much cheaper. What would be a more proportional way of allocating these costs when you're a local energy provider or local community provider?
So I think there's probably two parts to that question. One is around how we connect into the grid, which we do have projects connecting at different voltage levels, and also sort of historically at transmission and distribution level. I think that and the cost of our connection to the grid is produced by some kind of magic that is woven at at our distribution operator. So we don't necessarily have visibility of how our cost of connecting a project to the grid is determined. I will say that the nature of the grid connection is currently another constraint, which I should have mentioned, on the use of on the local supply model. So that is currently only available to projects that are connected at the lowest voltage to the distribution network. And so that does mean for us that there are certain projects where we are where we are the available connection happens to be at a different voltage, where actually that means at the moment, under the current regulatory system, local supply wouldn't be possible. I think that in terms of the broader costs of the system, obviously one of the benefits of local supply clubs, and where a local supply club approach to fixing the price problem is more targeted than regional-based pricing, is because it allows us to actually reward customers balancing their demand with our generation. And so that goes beyond just the benefit of having the customer and the generator in the same place, to a point where we can actually coordinate. So you turn your washing machine on when the sun's shining, you'll get a lower rate of electricity. And I think that I'm afraid that there was a question earlier about analysis. I don't have great analysis. I haven't yet seen, I hope it's out there, of what would actually be the savings to the transmission, the cost of expanding of strengthening the transmission grid, of having more power connected at that level. But I think that obviously there is a transmission cost built-in levy, that one of the levies that get loaded into bills is around supporting the cost of building and maintaining and strengthening the transmission grid. So there certainly could be an argument that would be one of the levies that arguably locally balanced supply and demand under a local power club should be exempt from.
Yes, but it should still be a proportional cost, of course, if you're a community.
You'll need to move on to your main question.
Happy to discuss this afterwards, Vera, whatever.
Right, and we had a number, but it is a very technical problem, and you talked about the regulatory changes, and I would really be interested, because that regulatory change seems to be at the bottom of a lot of the costs that make community energy very high, when it could be quite low. But I understand we are coming maybe to this at a different point. So can I come to the question set again around making community energy more attractive to investors? We have already heard some of the answers in your earlier questions, but to improve the liquidity of investment in community energy, what do you think of the idea of a credit facility provided to projects by the net zero hubs to buy withdrawn shares temporarily? Can I ask you?
Could you repeat the question?
So, to improve the liquidity of investment in community energy, what do you think of the idea of a credit facility provided to projects by the net zero hubs to buy withdrawn shares temporarily?
Okay, that to me sounds a little bit like what we're doing, in that what we're providing community energy, the community sector with, is what we call a community energy funding bridge. And that's to facilitate both the capital cost of building the project and the expertise that goes with that, but also complementing the shared ownership models as well, where effectively we're coming in with capital to get projects built, with the full expectation and hope that we will be crowded out by community investment in the long term. So the ownership of those projects from day one can be community owned, and then we can come in and help get them built, get them de-risked, and then effectively we are crowded out of those investments. So I guess yes, I would agree it would be a good thing to do, but and it seems to be working very well, but there isn't the scale at the moment because the projects aren't available because the viability is so slim.
Okay, there seems to be agreement with the panels, and in order to move on, to encourage investment and increase public awareness of community energy, should the government consider an information campaign combined with a guarantee scheme for investment of up to £10,000?
I think that would be enormously valuable.
Okay. Yes, no? Yes.
Is that at a residential level, effectively, for deploying renewable technology, household renewable technology? Yes.
Well, for individual, if I understand what you're suggesting, Vera, for individual prospective investors, for us member shareholders in community energy schemes, I think that would be hugely valuable. We know we need to reach more people and bring a wider base of people into community energy, and there's only so much we can do at our scale. I think we're starting to work together more to raise the profile of the sector across, with the help of the likes of Community Energy England or Community Energy England Scotland. But I think what you just described would be absolutely fantastic. So it's a hard yes from me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd agree as well. I mean, our fund is not aimed at the retail investor; it's aimed at the sophisticated investor. So, but certainly, we support platforms like FX, Abundance, others. A government program could only help.
Yeah. No, but the chair is keen to move on. A big yes to both questions.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Now, Matthew Clayton, you're here to represent a commercial developer. What are the biggest challenges that you face in seeking to enter into shared ownership with local communities?
We're a bit of to be called a commercial developer is quite flattering, but I think we straddle a divide between a very social investor, an impactful investor, and a commercial investor, quite proudly straddling that line, actually. I guess the problem we see and that we seek to fix through the community energy funding bridges and collaborative investment is that you'll have a commercial developer who's investing millions of pounds at very high risk, very high uncertainty into getting a project built, and wants the most seamless, frictionless process they possibly can. You've got a local authority who has got to make a planning decision, would love to involve the community, but doesn't actually have the remit or the toolkit to be able to encourage shared ownership in the project. And you've got a community energy group which is bubbling with excellent ideas, expertise and enthusiasm, but probably doesn't trust the commercial developer terribly and doesn't necessarily have the faith in the local project. So what we're aiming to do is provide models and of how this can work and how it does work. And for that, I think there needs to be a shared view of the value in doing it in the first instance. So I think that's really important. But I think bringing those groups together can be done. But what the developer needs is speed and certainty. And the way that manifests itself, there's a number of the projects which are probably referred to earlier on the shared ownership side, where written into the planning consent there'll be an invitation for a 20% stake in an enormous wind farm on the west coast of Scotland. And the way that manifests itself in practice, it's great, it's in the planning, it's factored into the planning process, but when it comes down to it, the developers put £2 or £3 million into developing that project. And then they've got to get to financial close as quickly as they can, get the turbines ordered, get the grid secured and everything. And they need to invite the community to invest. How are they going to do that? It's giving them a 1 month window to muster up in, if you're talking about a tens of megawatt scheme, multi-million pound investment for a community energy group to muster overnight is quite a challenging thing to do. So what we're doing is providing the bridging facility and the expertise to make sure those projects the communities can respond to those calls. And also to be able to do the due diligence on the projects to make sure that the developer isn't leaking value into their own coffers as opposed to the community coffer, so that then there is genuine shared ownership, there's genuine, that all parties are at the table in terms of the governance and the decision making, and hopefully the repowering opportunity beyond that and beyond that.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Now, for all three of you, what are your views on the potential effectiveness of offering incentives to developers, and are there unintended consequences of doing this as well? Perhaps if Hugh Goulbourne, you go first with this one.
Just to make sure I've understood the question correctly, is that a follow-on from the previous question? So in relation to sort of shared ownership schemes?
We were talking about this in the first panel actually as well. It's what is, how effective can it be in offering incentives to developers to make community partnerships work?
So effectively to get shared, to encourage shared ownership. I think similar. It's useful to continue from where Matthew finished, because both of the funds that, we haven't launched ours yet. I know you launched yours yesterday, Matthew. Both of our funds are looking to do something similar in terms of helping community groups to bridge both where they're developing themselves, but where they come forward with opportunities like this, and they could take 10-20% out of a much bigger development, to have the finance available to do that in the timescale that a developer needs them to do that. So I think the incentive to encourage a developer to do it, I think the point raised by one of your members that Matthew alluded to is probably the right one. I mean, our view is that a developer should want to have this extra capital, right? Because they're trying to raise hundreds of millions of pounds to do lots of developments, both in the UK and internationally. So from our perspective as people who work with investors, we would be a bit confused as to why a developer wouldn't want a 20% share taken out. It should be quite attractive if it's structured, as Matthew said, in the right way. Mm-hmm. So I'm not convinced I know why they should need to have additional incentives. The incentive should be there from having a wider capital mix into those projects.
And I think,
I'll go to Matthew Clayton first, because I've got a follow-up question for you, Helen, shortly.
Yeah. I think reflecting on the first session where Jake mentioned the 5 megawatts plus 5 megawatts scheme, where that effectively gave the developer access to more value by involving a community energy group, was really productive and really worked. So I think that there needs to be that alignment of value, and I don't think it would take much in the current climate with the prevailing conditions. The community coming in with a CFD plus a very small margin would make a difference to it, and encourage something which placed a different planning time horizon. With high levels of community engagement, or something which placed the grid queue is completely being reevaluated at the moment. If the community aid component of that was built into the grid queue process, then I think you'd have developers like advertising for communities to get involved.
Yeah.
Interesting. And Helen Martin, while you're answering or following up on your colleagues' comments, what are your views on the ideas of giving communities the right to purchase a stake in local energy projects, or requiring developers to make minimum shared ownership offers?
So I think we've been actively looking at this, and I think the responses. So we've been sort of essentially cold calling developers who we know are looking at or develop in some way through developing projects in sort of our local area, if you like. And the answers at the moment either vary from no response, which is the majority of cases, to one or two cases where you've got a really forward-thinking developer who sees the value.
Sorry to interrupt. How do you know who to cold call?
We're tracking planning applications, these kinds of things, early pre-apps. So arguably we're getting in too late, but basically the onus is on us. We're calling people. At best, we are in the process of, we hope, moving towards structuring this kind of scheme. And the main concerns that I think that you're right, Hugh, that where developers understand where community energy is coming from, and with this, and in the light of the public discussion around local power plan, the idea that community energy organisations may well be able to come with finance is a part of the equation. And I think that forward-thinking developers are, see the value of the broader value of having community ownership. But it's 1 out of 20 calls that we make. If there were incentives, and certainly if there were a mandate, then obviously I would assume that those developers would instead be calling us, and it would be completely change the game.
Cool. Thank you. Talk, Clayton.
Thank you, Chair, and you've kind of anticipated my question, Matthew and Helen, by talking about these incentives. So if CFD plus, by that I assume you mean if there's a community element to your application for CFD, then you'll be bumped up that queue. Mm-hmm. That if there was a grid connection application which had a community element, say 25% or 20%, it would get bumped up the queue as well. Yeah. And also, is there a case? Yes, I guess I just made it. Is there a case for a CFD for communities, just a different price structure for community connections? I just
sometimes the committee members give evidence as well as ask questions.
Yeah, there's nod in agreement.
You'll be noticed. Yeah.
It's great that we all shared notes. No, I think that the CFD, a marginal premium on the CFD for community-owned projects or the shared ownership would make a very material difference, and wouldn't represent a huge cost. But I think that if you look at the stack of concerns for project developers at the moment, number 1, number 2, and number 3 is grid at the moment. So anything we can do about the grid, and GB Energy investing that very large figure into grid and alleviating the grid problem sooner or later is probably the most powerful thing it can do in terms of achieving the 2030 target. But then anything that effectively, I must confess, I'm not a fan of mandating community ownership, which might make me quite unpopular. But what I am a fan of is creating an incentive framework, which can be marginal, but just enough, so that then the spirit of the organisations, both the developer and the community, are come together in a really positive way. Because my concern is if it's mandated, it becomes a commodity, a product, which isn't really what community energy is about. So it's bringing together the developers who are minded to with the communities that would love to, that I think is where the sweet spot is. So mandating doesn't work for me. Well, it would work, but I don't think it would achieve the spirit of community energy.
I would just add on the CFDs, I mean, one of the things that we would say is that our fund would like to obviously invest across technologies, right? But most of the technology plays we see at the moment would be solar, and a bit of wind, I guess, coming forward more, particularly with planning changes. I think there's some very interesting technologies that we used to invest in 10, 15 years ago, CO2 sense, like small-scale hydro, run-of-the-river hydro, that CFDs there could certainly be below sort of 5 megawatts would help with that sort of technology, because some of those are quite uninvestable at the moment, or a challenge to invest in.
Just specifically on the CFD idea, obviously I don't have direct experience of the CFD because we can't access it at the moment. I understand it's a very complex process with very lengthy contracts, and that it would just be, I just wanted to flag that I think we would need to make sure that we look at making sure that any community-specific CFD window were relatively simple to access and document.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. There you go.
Thank you. Obviously, in the past, we had tax relief on investment in community energy. What difference did that make, and how would reinstating it compare to other ways to help finance community energy in terms of impact and importance?
I mean, I can start on that. I think it's really hard to, like, on our specific experience, it's quite hard to unpick what difference it made, because it basically it went along with most other things. So the feed-in tariff, the 5+5 scheme for shared ownership development. So it's hard to unpick specifically what difference the tax incentives made. I think that from our engagement with our own investor members, I think that it seems to have an oddly disproportionate impact so where we've surveyed our members, and it's a small sample size, we have 2,000 members, of whom maybe 10-20% are responding, or less than that even, but almost all of the people, a large proportion of people who respond, say that tax relief would make a big difference in their it's sort of the number one factor that people say would make a difference in their decision to invest, or the amount that they're investing. While on the other hand, people say that the level of interest that they're being offered is not the primary reason why they're investing. Yeah, so it doesn't seem like there's a sort of, from what people tell us, now we haven't been able to obviously test this, but on a sort of pound for pound trade-off, it does seem like there is a signalling around tax relief that attracts people's attention or makes them feel, draws people towards making a particular investment. I think that the relatively strong performance of bond issues by community organisations also points to this. Again, there are differences because the risk profile of a bond versus a member share is different. But they do tend, we have seen routinely that those tend to go much faster and attract much more attention, and that's partly, we believe, because those are eligible, for example, innovative finance ISAs, whereas member share issues by community energy organisations aren't. So it's a bit anecdotal, but I think we have reason to believe that it's sort of oddly and disproportionately valuable to attracting people's attention to this as an investment opportunity.
And I think, again, if we look at the flows of capital, particularly like retail capital, if you like, rather than institutional capital, the peaks we've probably seen over the last 20 years has been when there was VCT eligibility, then followed in a very material way by the EIS boom, as I'd call it, where effectively the EIS was running at the same time as the ROCs and the introduction of the feed-in tariff. So there was a really big inflow. And I think that this comes back to the three stalls that value that the project needs. Effectively, that's lowering the cost of capital to the project, because it's turning a 5% return or a 4% return into a 6, 7, 8% return for the investor. So that really helps. But I would caution this. I guess the VCT and the IS schemes got pulled specifically for renewables because there was a risk that it was double counted, or people were double dipping. They were getting a tax break and benefiting from subsidy indirectly through the investment. But the other thing that I would amend if I was to review or implement something like that again is the time horizon. Because particularly with EIS, I think there was a 5-year time horizon, which if we're looking for wide ownership, long-term, patient investment, doesn't really work with a renewable energy project, because effectively what you saw is a lot of projects get built with the EIS capital, which was all those assets were then flipped into institutional money and international money over the 5-year horizon of the EIS eligibility. So if we were doing that with a view to delivering more renewables, I think alignment between the incentive and the underlying asset would be appropriate.
So you are concerned that reinstating it still risk a double subsidy. Do you have any suggestions for overcoming that problem?
Well, I'd argue there isn't a subsidy anymore, because the CFD just provides price stability. It's not a subsidy. So I think that was overcome very successfully with the removal of the ROC and the feed-in tariff.
I mean, these things add up, right? So, I mean, the different levers. You could add a grant funding, particularly at the early stages of a project. You can intervene to add a little bit of value onto the price that community organisations can access, the level of the price. Different, which is a different, as Matthew said, from the stability. All of these things contribute to being able to have a project with, and lower cost finance, of course, from GB Energy being another one, or backing, credit backing of the kind of fund that Hugh's trying to set up. All of these things contribute. It's not like we're at risk of making excessive returns at the moment. So, and I do think there is a particular value, as I said, potentially of signalling around an incentive mechanism which could be specific. I think there's a suggestion to community energy, which is obviously different to what was the case before when this was a renewable, a wide EIS incentive that seems to have a value that is maybe punches a little above its weight in terms of bringing more investors in.
I'm not going to talk against the idea of having EIS relief. I think if it was offered to us by the Treasury, we'd take it. So that's everything I say now is not should be caveated with that. But one of to build on your point, Helen, in our pooled fund idea, something that Matthew said is already our modelling shows that it's pretty narrow returns on investment. So the kinds of high net worth or foundations and institutional investors that are investing in this are not investing for the high return. These are asset-backed investments, so relatively low risk in that sense. The other element of it, though, is it's that safety, as I said in my introductory remarks. So if an element of this, there will be defaults, there will be projects that don't go forward for one reason or another, even in the community energy space. And so it's, I think, another way of doing it, if you want to be very specific to the type of project, the type of investor, is for GB Energy, Treasury, whatever, to use its backstop in terms of guaranteeing some of those funds, both Matthews and ourselves. And that also, to Helen's point, gives the investor the confidence. There's nothing, when you're sitting in an investor meeting, there's nothing more that adds confidence than saying that government's got some skin in this game. And to say that you've got a Treasury guaranteed or backed scheme will always help raise investment.
The other element of tax relief that we have seen, again, we've been doing this for 30 years, and up till about, I want to say 15 years ago, then there was, on the smaller projects, we didn't pay business rates in Scotland on our hydro schemes that we had there. And that, I mean, we know that exemption was dropped about 15 years ago. But just those elements, you know, in terms of, they can make a big difference to the operational model and begin to make up the scale challenge for community energy.
You don't, between you, seem to be expressing a preference one or the other. You're saying that all these things could contribute, but do you have any sense for which is the most important thing for government to do?
I think in terms of mobilising capital, a tax break on the investment itself would really would create a lot of momentum for investment in the space. Because before, I guess the last EIS wave, if you like, had the benefit of it not only being a tax break and a tax incentive, but there was effectively a 20-year business model with an inflation-linked revenue stream attached to it. We've no longer got that revenue certainty, but I think that the tax break changing the investment case from a 4, 5, 6% to a 6, 7, 8% return for investors would materially change the picture.
I'd agree with that. My comments are only made in an environment where we understand that obviously Treasury is fiscally constrained.
Yeah. And in terms of getting renewable energy projects done, I think that relating back to my initial comment, that the most important thing is to get a revenue, is to address the price structure. And from our perspective, the most effective way of doing that, because it would also allow us to encourage local balancing, would be around creating upside from a right to local supply and levy exemptions or other pricing mechanism that rewards local supply clubs. Along with price stability mechanisms, I think that could go a long way to creating a viable business model. And once you've got a viable business model, you can generally get it financed.
Thank you all very much. Helen Martin, Hugh Goulbourne, Matthew Clayton, thank you for your evidence. That is the end of our session. Order.